event. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, 10 years is a short time in the history of war zone rape, a crime as old as war itself. Yet, the past 10 years have seen more concerted action to combat this scourge than the rest of human history combined. Indeed, the past decade has ushered in a dramatic shift of paradigm and perspective. It has heralded a new consciousness and a new consensus that conflict-related sexual violence is a threat to international peace and security. What had long been dismissed as inevitable is now understood as preventable. What had once been deemed collateral or cultural is today condemned as criminal. The understanding that sexual violence is often commanded, committed, or condoned as a means of pursuing the military and ideological aims of armed groups has generated new strategic approaches to fighting back. It has prompted political as well as humanitarian solutions. Milestones such as today's anniversary event provide critical opportunities to step back from our daily work and take stock of progress, challenges, and change. Our reflections here today on the factors that have enabled or constrained progress will help us to chart ambitious ways forward. I'm confident that this gathering will strengthen our strategic partnership and amplify an array of vital voices on a subject that has been called history's greatest silence. This conspiracy of silence has served to shield the perpetrators and isolate the victims from support systems and even from each other. A critical aspect of my mandate is therefore bridging the perspectives of survivors to policy-making bodies and providing them with a platform to be heard, including by the donor and diplomatic community. At the heart of today's event is a survivors' hearing, a chance to foster solidarity with the survivors and those working to support them on the front lines. Our greatest models of political courage are often those who have the least access to power and resources and face the highest risk. I would therefore like to profoundly thank the survivors who have joined us today and acknowledge the courage it takes to revisit moments of pain and trauma so that the world can learn from their experience, expand their empathy, and heed their calls for change. These survivors hail from different cultures and commitments. They represent diverse profiles in terms of age, gender, and ethnicity, reminding us that sexual violence survivors are not a homogeneous group. They include male victims who may be overlooked due to stereotypical assumptions about masculine invulnerability, detainees sexually abused during interrogation in order to coerce confessions and destroy morale, rural women, indigenous women, human rights defenders, and journalists, children born of wartime rape who are often shunned as bad blood or children of the enemy, placing them at a heightened risk of abandonment, indigence, and exploitation. Forced wives and captives of terrorist and violent extremist groups who are often viewed as affiliates rather than victims, refugees and LGBTI individuals who face the risk of further persecution and in some cases prosecution for simply daring to report their case. A survivor-centered, rights-based response requires tailored, contextual solutions. It means giving voice and choice to survivors, restoring their agency, building their resilience, and enshrining their experience on the historical record. Solidarity and empathy must lead to action. This is why today's event will also mark the official launch of the new Global Fund for Survivors. While I have visited many diverse, war-torn corners of the world, the survivors I have met have consistently demanded two things above all else. Firstly, that the perpetrators be brought to justice and that they be provided with material assistance to rebuild their lives and livelihoods. Reparations are what survivors want most, yet receive least. The dawn of a new decade for this mandate is the time to deliver on these demands and to put survivors first. The progress we have made to date has been transformative in three key respects, namely in terms of the normative framework, our institutional capacity, and operational impact. Firstly, in terms of the normative evolution, 2008 saw the issue of sexual violence as a tactic of war elevated onto the agenda of the world's paramount peace and security body, the United Nations Security Council, through the unanimous adoption of Resolution 1820. For the survivors, this signaled that their ordeal would be taken seriously, not only as a violation of individual human rights, but also as a threat to collective security, an impediment to peace building, and a crime of concern to the international community as a whole. The breakthrough policy framework dismantled the classical gender divide between hard security and so-called soft issues, and between political and private matters by viewing war through the eyes of civilians whose bodies had been part of the battlefield. It served to directly engage peace and security stakeholders, including those responsible for imposing targeted sanctions on perpetrators, framing the mandates of peacekeeping missions, sponsoring peace talks, overseeing the implementation of ceasefire agreements, establishing commissions of inquiry and hybrid tribunals, and referring situations to the International Criminal Court. In short, it gave security actors new responsibilities and gave survivors and their advocates new avenues for accountability and action. This came as a backdrop of sexual violence having been omitted from peace agreements, even in conflict where it was a notorious feature of the fighting, as in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. It was also absent from the mandate of peacekeeping mission in the 1990s, such as UNAMIR in Rwanda, where rape was used as a tool of the genocide, and UNPROFOR in the Balkans, where sexual violence was widespread and systematic. Resolution 1820 made it clear that as a war crime, crime against humanity, and constituent act of genocide, sexual violence had to be addressed in transitional justice processes and excluded from the scope of amnesty provisions. The international community had accepted that a ceasefire could not be comprehensive if the gunfire stops, but the patterns of rape persist. Secondly, in terms of institutional arrangements, the adoption of Resolution 1888 in 2009 was a landmark development in this agenda, equipping the United Nations with new infrastructure to respond. And this included the creation of my mandate to provide coherent and strategic leadership to global efforts, including as chair of the Interagency Coordination Network, UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict. I would like to pay tribute to the work of my predecessors in this role, Margot Wallström and Zainab Hawa Bangura, who I am delighted to have with us today. Their efforts were instrumental in laying the groundwork for translating resolutions into solutions. Security Council Resolution 1888 also established a team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict to strengthen institutional safeguards against impunity at the national level, and called for women protection advisors to be deployed to the field to enhance our monitoring, reporting, and response. Subsequent resolutions have authorized specific monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements at country level as part of a system to deepen the evidence base for action and to increase the pressure on parties to comply with international norms by listing or naming and shaming those credibly suspected of abuse. They have emphasized the need for early warning and prevention and to combat sexual violence employed as a tactic of terrorism, including in the context of human trafficking. Most recently, Resolution 2467, adopted in April of this year, calls for a holistic, survivor-centered approach to inform all prevention and response measures. Turning to the question of the operational impact, the United Nations system is today reaching and supporting thousands of survivors who had once been invisible and inaccessible. Peacekeepers are now systematically trained to detect, deter, and respond to sexual violence as part of their operational readiness standards. Sexual violence offenses have become an integral part of international criminal investigations, thanks to a growing cadre of legal specialists in this field. A dedicated court on sexual and gender-based violence was established in Liberia, and a similar court is due to be launched in South Sudan. Mobile courts and military tribunals have convicted senior officials of sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Specific designation criteria on sexual violence have been included in the sanctions regime for the Central African Republic, the DRC, Libya, Somalia, and South Sudan. In several affected settings, the operational arms of my mandate, the team of experts on the rule of law, and UN Action Network are delivering concrete projects to support survivors. As part of our operational methodology, which focuses on anchoring commitments at the national level, my office has signed joint communique to prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence with almost all of the countries that fall within my remit. At the same time, we have begun to engage with non-state armed groups implicated in patterns of sexual violence in contexts such as Central African Republic, Mali, and South Sudan. Enhanced scrutiny and pressure is needed to ensure that all parties seize these violations and prevent their recurrence. Despite this momentous progress, my field missions over the past 2 years have revealed persistent gaps in services and resources, which make it virtually impossible for victims to move forward as survivors. In Iraq, I met Yazidi women and girls who had received neither medical nor psychosocial support several months after their release from ISIL captivity and sexual enslavement. In the DRC, I met women and girls afflicted by the double tragedy of rape and rejection, with no access to credit or economic opportunity after being abandoned by their husbands and cast out of their homes. In the Central African Republic, survivors from remote villages described being forced to walk for several days to reach basic healthcare facilities in the aftermath of sexual assault. I also vividly recall the words of a young Nigerian girl I met in Maiduguri who had been raped by a militant while collecting firewood outside of a camp. She expressed deep shame and frustration at being repeatedly questioned by a doctor before receiving treatment. "Why did you leave the camp to collect firewood?" he asked her. "Why did you go out alone? Why did you not fight back harder and scream louder?" In the camps I visited in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, Rohingya women and girls recounted how they had been repeatedly questioned and pressured to share the stories of rape in graphic detail. Some had been interviewed so frequently they could no longer distinguish between humanitarian service providers, journalists, NGO workers, and academic researchers. And despite all these interviews, justice and redress remain elusive. Ladies and gentlemen, beyond the walls of our conference rooms, in towns and villages where war has broken out and law has broken down, sexual violence remains a cruel tactic of torture, terror, and political repression used to signal that nothing is sacred and no one is safe. The response continues to be painfully slow. Impunity remains the rule and justice the rare exception. Services are scarce and stigma is so intense that some survivors choose to remain with their captors and abusers rather than having to return to their loved ones, look them in the eye, and feel the shame of their reproach. Security policy is still a male-dominated domain despite clear and compelling evidence linking gender equality with peace. The international community has not yet adequately invested in tackling the structural root causes that perpetrate the violence, including militarization, arms proliferation, inequality, forced displacement, and expanding cycles of violence and revenge. Social cohesion, recovery, and development depend on survivors being able to reintegrate into the rhythm of daily life in the context of their community. It means being able to resume the quiet miracle of a normal life, which so many of us take for granted. So let us seize this moment to set the stage for a new decade of decisive action to remove sexual violence from our daily headlines and relegate it once and for all to the annals of history. Let us live up to the founding promise of the UN Charter to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, including from its most intimate, ancient, and enduring atrocity, the scourge of wartime rape. Thank you for your attention.